Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to the workshop final briefings. This is in fact the culminating element of our curriculum and really the culminating event of the year. This is where we take all of the knowledge that we've learned from environmental chemistry and toxicology over the summer to environmental ethics, to financial management and everything in between, and apply it to problem solving. And so at this point, our class is a group of problem solving sustainability professionals, as we'll see 5 examples of this work today. We do this work as a public service. We contribute our effort to making the world a better place. And the workshop is really one of the most important elements of our curriculum. We prepare you for this exercise with clients by spending an entire 2 semesters working on simulation. And I think the results, as you'll see today, are quite impressive. This has been an incredible learning experience for everybody in a very tough environment. First time we've done this kind of work without actually being together in the same room. Certainly when we started last year, we never thought we would continue to do this in the way we're doing it. But just the same, the work is spectacular, and we'll begin with our first project, which Colleen Neely will present, advised by Professor Eileen McGinnis, on advancing racial justice. So Colleen, if you're ready, take it away.
Okay, great, thank you. Good morning, my name is Colleen Neely, and today I have the privilege to speak with you about our work with the NAACP focused on advancing racial justice in federal flood policy. This plaque was unveiled in New Orleans in 2015, honoring the 3,400 families of the lower Ninth Ward who were disproportionately exposed to the relentless waters of the Mississippi River when a levee surrounding the community was breached during Hurricane Katrina. The lower Ninth Ward is a predominantly Black community where nearly 40% of families live on less than $15,000 a year. While narrative originally attributed the storm strength to the breach, later investigations actually showed that it was a combination of Army Corps cost-cutting measures and miscommunication of risk that led to insufficient and negligent levee design. In fact, the federal judge presiding over related lawsuits said in his ruling, "One central theme that has been painfully obvious is that many of the levees protecting New Orleans were tragically flawed. But despite this incredible acknowledgement, most communities never saw justice because of laws that give immunity to the Army Corps, no matter how negligent." And while nearly all of New Orleans flooded during Katrina, 80% of people in flooded areas were Black, surfacing the disproportionate impact flooding has on communities of color. And disparities are present across the United States, not just in New Orleans. A study found that when communities experience natural disasters, white individuals accumulate $75,000 in wealth, whereas Black individuals lose $50,000 in wealth. And this underscores one of the starkest racial disparities in the United States: the profound gap in post-disaster outcomes between white and Black communities as a result of uneven access to federal aid, favoring those with more resources and higher property values. Our work and the mission of our capstone client, the NAACP, the oldest racial justice organization in the US with over 2,000 chapters, rests at this juncture. Through their environmental and climate justice program, the NAACP works to empower communities in advocating for climate justice and to hold institutions like the Army Corps accountable for upholding civil and human rights. And with this focus, the NAACP asks us to make recommendations for advancing racial justice in federal flood policy focused on the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And over the next 3 slides, we will review the Army Corps' role in flood management. The Army Corps plays a major role in the selection, design, and construction of major flood infrastructure across the US, like the 13,000 miles of levees you see in pink, as well as dams and nature-based infrastructure like wetlands. And at the center of the Corps' project selection process is the benefit cost analysis, or BCA. And simply put, when economic, social, and environmental benefits that a community may experience from flood protection exceeds project costs, project approval is more likely. But however, and problematically, economic considerations have historically dominated because they're easily quantified. But in not fully considering the social and environmental benefits a community may experience from added structural resilience, projects in low wealth, low property value, and communities of color are systematically deprioritized. But the BCA is not the only barrier. Army Corps flood infrastructure projects require the local community to cost share in the project, which can amount to millions of dollars, pricing out low wealth communities with small tax bases. Learning about the barriers within Army Corps policies established a starting point for our work. But to more deeply understand the impact on communities, we developed, in collaboration with the NAACP, a series of guiding questions which we will discuss next. Our questions begin foundationally. How does the Army Corps' project development process work, and does it result in racial disparities? And how are communities impacted by the processes and procedures? Then, how can the Army Corps better protect communities of color and advance racial justice? And how can the NAACP use our findings to promote their climate and racial justice goals? So now I'm excited to move us into our key findings, which were, first, that data shows disparity. Second, that community advocacy works. And third, that the Army Corps does recognize that disparity exists. Using census and flood exposure data, we conducted mapping and analysis exercises to identify relationships between socioeconomic variables and flood exposure. This is one of the maps we created showing the percent of properties at risk of flooding within the greater St. Louis area. Focusing east of the Mississippi River, we see Centerville, Illinois. This community is 95% Black with nearly a 50% poverty rate and a median property value of $53,000, and experiences some of the highest rates of flood exposure in the region, with nearly 40% of properties at risk of flooding. These community characteristics are the result of historic racist redlining practices, as well as disparities stemming from Army Corps local cost sharing requirements for projects. In 2009, the community was found to need significant flood infrastructure upgrades, but because they could not afford the cost share, they were made to wait 10 years until they could. Meanwhile, the community experienced significant sewage overflow events due to the inundation of floodwaters. And this is harmful not only to the environment, but also to human health and dignity, and highlights disparities that can result from community cost share requirements. Our second finding is that community advocacy works. For nearly a decade, the Army Corps has been involved in a controversial project off the coast of Texas that threatens the local ecology and economy of the region. Bayou City Waterkeeper, an environmental advocacy group in Greater Houston, has been on the front lines pushing the Corps for more socially and environmentally holistic designs. Through the Freedom of Information Act, Bayou City obtained files showing the exact locations of Corps proposed infrastructure, as you see here. And this was really pivotal because it showed, in a way not previously disclosed, the homes and businesses that would be impacted or displaced through eminent domain. In addition to this, Bayou City educated coastal communities on alternatives to this traditional hard infrastructure, things such as oyster reefs, wetlands, and expanding land conservation along the coast. And these efforts ultimately helped to mobilize massive numbers to engage the Corps and make clear their desire for greater use of nature-based infrastructure, which did result in the Corps reconsidering elements of their proposed project. The third finding is that the Army Corps does recognize that disparity exists. And to the Corps' credit, they have made several significant policy changes to address this issue, two of which we will review. First, in an attempt to rectify racial and income disparities, the Army Corps has instituted a pilot program to eliminate local cost share requirements for project feasibility studies, which would help low-wealth frontline communities like those in Centerville. And second, the Army Corps has internally mandated that social and environmental impacts, the use of nature-based infrastructure, and the impacts of climate change must be considered within their cost-benefit analyses. And both of these present opportunities for the NAACP to push for pilot program consideration in eligible Black communities and to advocate for the expansion of this program, as well as to hold the Corps accountable for implementing this new policy directive. Now we will review the recommendations being presented to our client later this month and also discuss how the NAACP plans to incorporate these findings and recommendations into their existing advocacy strategies and frameworks. Building off the existing strong relationships with local chapters, we recommend that the national office acts as a central hub for notifying local chapters about public comment periods, identifying potential partners for coalition building and cost sharing, and serve as an educational resource for understanding Army Corps planning processes. The NAACP also has the opportunity to play an important role in holding federal officials accountable to ensure that social and environmental considerations become central to project approval and that these factors are being incorporated within the Corps' cost-benefit analysis. Finally, we recommend that local chapters advocate for expanded and more equitable flood infrastructure by approaching elected officials, congresspeople, senators, and local Army Corps staff, as well as through public pressure tactics such as social media campaigns, writing op-eds, and overwhelming public comment periods. A second recommendation is to use investigative research and legal tactics, such as submitting Freedom of Information Act requests, like we saw with Bayou City Waterkeeper, as well as using lawsuits to push for more transparency and to challenge undesirable projects. We are living in a historic moment for racial justice in the United States. Army Corps policy reforms and the Biden-Harris administration represent a pivotal opportunity for the NAACP to hold policymakers accountable in advancing the needs of Black and low-wealth communities across the country and bring to fruition a nation that focuses not on achieving the greatest economic return, but instead on prioritizing, strengthening, and empowering frontline communities and collectively building a more resilient and just United States. And as a closing thought for us to linger on, I would like to quote from Amanda Gorman's powerful and inspiring inaugural poem, The Hill We Climb. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. And I would like to say thank you and open up the floor for questions.
Okay, do we have any questions? Stephanie will recognize you if we have.
You guys can raise your digital Zoom hands or type it in the chat. All right, so we have a question from Daria. Daria, are you able to unmute yourself or do you want to type it in the chat?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, so I heard a lot the Army Corps mentioned, but I didn't hear Congress mentioned once, or really any recommendations on what local governments can do or state governments. And I work for the Army Corps of Engineers, but I'm not here representing them today. I'm here because I'm a Columbia SEPA grad. And I think like your recommendations are missing and misunderstanding how the Corps functions on a fundamental level that undermines their effectiveness. The Corps cost shares are part of the authorization for us to participate in any action, in any study, or in any construction or recommendation. And the Corps doesn't have leeway to change those without congressional authority. And similarly, the way that we recommend and the way that we authorize projects not only needs the support of the non-federal sponsors, but Congress as well. And so there really needs to be a multifaceted discussion and approach that acknowledges the Corps' limitations, both in terms of what we are allowed to look at and what we're paid to look at, because we charge our time in 15-minute increments to projects. And so like Congress keeps a pretty hard fist on what we can do, and we don't set our own policies. So saying like that, you know,
Sorry, thank you for
yeah.
your comment and question. Let's let the group respond. I think we got the point. Go ahead, Colleen.
Thank you for questions and comments, Daria. So we do recognize, and through our project, and we did learn that Congress and the Office of Management and Budget do have a large part in this process as well. For this project with the NAACP and for what we presented this morning, we are focusing on where the NAACP can apply pressure and advocate within the Army Corps. But in our larger recommendations to the NAACP, we did include advocacy recommendations in Washington to address those challenges that exist within Congress and the Office of Management and Budget that do also present barriers for communities to have projects approved in their communities.
Do you also have a recommendation for local governments to institute zoning practices that keep disadvantaged communities out of the floodplain?
No, we didn't address that directly within our recommendations to the NAACP, but again, we do acknowledge that we do acknowledge that this project, or excuse me, that flood vulnerability and flood exposure exists within multiple layers of government, not just at the federal level, but also, yes, absolutely at the local level in terms of zoning practices and policies. But we did not address that directly within the scope of this project.
Let's move to Elizabeth's question. We only have a little bit more time for this group. Elizabeth, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Sure. Thanks so much for that really interesting presentation, Colleen. You touched on this a little bit, your use of data and mapping, and I was just really interested in what that process was, and I'm sure that was really kind of a challenging thing to take on. So I'd just love to hear a little more about what was involved there.
Colleen, you're on mute.
Oh, thank you for that question, Liz. So we selected 3 case study areas: St. Louis, Missouri, Indianapolis, as well as New Orleans. And like you indicated, we did mapping exercises. We mapped socioeconomic variables such as property value, race, income, poverty level in relationship to flood exposure. And we were looking to see where there were relationships between exposure and things such as, again, race, property value, income. It was a fun exercise, but yes, as you indicated, it was challenging, especially data collection and analyzing that data, and ultimately aligning that data with the literature and having those complement each other versus only having literature to support our research or only having data. We had to merge the two. Thanks, Liz.
Do we have time for one more question for this group? Do we have any?
No more questions.
Okay, well, Colleen, thank you, and thank you to the group.